European leaders refused to meet with Biden at G20 meeting. With the G20 meeting held successfully, Western leaders, represented by Germany and France, have recently lined up to meet with China at a high level, and after the talks, briefings from all sides have released very rich information. Political news sites have written articles specifically comparing the US with Germany, claiming that the recent high-level meetings between Biden and Scholz with China highlight the difference between the two countries' attitudes toward China. This difference is likely to evolve into a political disagreement between the United States and Germany. The news site singled out Germany for comparison with the United States, partly because Germany is Europe's largest economy and has deep economic and trade ties with China, and Scholz is the first Western leader to visit China on his own initiative in recent times, making him more representative from either perspective. Scholz's attitude, to a certain extent, also reflects the EU's view of China-EU relations. So, on the surface, there are differences between the US and German attitudes toward China, but it is the EU as a large group that can really fight with the US. The difference between the US and German attitudes toward China is actually a difference between the US and European attitudes toward China. However, this issue is more complicated, so we need to expand to speak slowly. First of all, where does this difference lie? As we all know by now, Scholz's visit to China was accompanied by a business delegation of top German companies, which shows that the main purpose is to deepen bilateral economic and trade relations with the Chinese side. When Biden met with the Chinese side at a high level, half of the 8 participants were officials in charge of national security affairs, including 2 of our familiar faces. One is the U.S. National Security Advisor Sullivan, the other is the U.S. National Security Council Coordinator of Indo-Pacific Affairs, known as the Indo-Pacific Czar. Indo-Pacific Czar, Campbell. The U.S. side's preference for national security composition may also indicate that the U.S. ostensibly does not seek conflict with China, but secretly still lists China as a threat. The EU, on the other hand, has a different view on this issue and considers China as a desirable partner. We can also see that Germany and France, the 2 largest economies of the EU, are always one of the main topics of Sino-European relations in their contacts with the Chinese side. During Scholz's visit to China, he stressed that Europe cannot be decoupled from China. And at the G20 summit, French President Emmanuel Macron also said that France is willing to actively promote Sino-European dialogue and cooperation, advocating independent diplomacy and opposing confrontation between camps. Why do the US and Europe have very different positions for China? The reason is actually very simple, that is, for the future direction of the evolution of the world landscape, the United States and the EU countries have fundamental differences. Both Germany and France are the beneficiaries of the multipolar world pattern advocated by China. Therefore, both countries want to guide a smooth transition in Europe, establish a stable partnership with China and join forces to tackle challenges at the global level. As for the United States, the strategic direction remains to maintain its unipolar hegemony. The signal behind this difference is already very clear in the face of the current China. It is no longer possible for the US and Europe to be of one mind. Of course, we also need to be clear, that is, although there are indeed differences between the US and European attitudes toward China, but there is still an ideological alliance between the US and Europe and such a layer of contact, long-term political and military level to the US-EU, if you want to seek to establish an independent and autonomous relationship with China, is bound to be strong constraints from the US side. In addition, the EU does not have a unified voice around China-EU relations so far. Germany and France can indeed influence the direction of the EU, but not to the extent of a single word. At present, the EU can be geographically divided into 2 factions, Old Europe and New Europe, with Old Europe mainly located in Western Europe, represented by Germany, France and Italy. The new Europe consists mainly of Eastern European countries. Compared with the old Europe, the new Europe countries have less say in the EU, are more dependent on the US, have more negative and radical views on Sino-European relations, and their political positions are basically in favor of the US, ignoring the EU's demands in the multipolar world. The political stance is basically in favor of the US and ignores the demands of the EU in the multipolar world. The different views of the old and new European factions on China-Europe relations make the EU's policy toward China very obvious. This oscillation, in turn, can be seen as a dynamic balance in the current relationship between the US and Europe. After Europe, Japan and Australia have also shown their willingness to dialogue with China. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida also said that he is currently discussing with China the possibility of a meeting between the leaders of the two countries and hopes to have a meeting with China that would help develop relations between the two countries. And Australian Prime Minister Albanese, before leaving for a series of meetings, including the G20, on the 11th, said that the Australian side wants to improve relations with China, its biggest partner. According to his words, "What I would like to see is cooperation with China when possible, and dialogue is always good." Australian Foreign Minister Huang Yingzhan also said the following day that his country wanted to work more closely with China on issues such as climate change as part of an ongoing effort to restart relations between the two countries. It is not hard to see that even Australia and Japan, which are allies of the United States, now have to temporarily put aside their hostility toward China and seek to moderate their relations with China and seek more cooperation. The reason for this situation today is that when Europe is in deep trouble, they desperately hope that the big brother of the United States can give them some help, but at this time the United States, out of the pursuit of their own interests, turned their attention to the Asia-Pacific region, according to media reports. The U.S. White House issued a statement that President Joe Biden attended the U.S. and ASEAN Leaders Summit on the same day and decided to upgrade the relationship between the United States and ASEAN to Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. The news about the U.S. and ASEAN upgrading their relationship has been out for a long time, and in May this year, the U.S. hosted a special U.S.-ASEAN summit, when U.S. and ASEAN leaders announced they would adjust their relationship later this year. In response to this move by the U.S. and ASEAN, we had mentioned earlier that China is happy to see the U.S. and other extraterritorial countries play an important role in the peaceful development of the region, but will never accept any actions that undermine local unity, peace, and stability. For this time, the US and ASEAN raise the level of relations. The outside world believes that the US is still using ASEAN as a pawn. The United States is indeed too much. Europe is a hardcore ally of the United States, but in the ally in need of help, as the big brother of the United States, not only not to lend a helping hand, but also beat the dog. Even if Europe is more obedient, cannot stand it. France, one of the leaders of the EU, took the lead. Macron publicly criticized the United States unkind, and also joined forces with another leader, Germany. Macron and Scholz met a few days ago, and both sides agreed that if the United States insisted on continuing to harvest Europe, then Europe will have to take retaliatory action. After this Russia-Ukraine war, Europe should also see the real purpose of the United States. The Russian-Ukrainian war, promoted by the United States, can be described as a double whammy. Without a single soldier, not only successfully weakened Russia's military and economic strength, but also created a bunch of crises for Europe, so that the EU began to embark on the road from strength to weakness. And the latter, the EU only after its own crisis, suddenly realized. Europe's energy dependence on Russia is extremely high, but in order to sanction Russia, European countries cut off almost all energy cooperation with Russia, especially cooperation in natural gas, making the EU directly into a huge energy crisis. The US seems to think that the energy crisis is far from enough to hit the EU's strength, and took advantage of the energy shortage in Europe to take over the European natural gas market, becoming the second largest natural gas supplier in Europe. However, the price of LNG exported to Europe by the US is extremely high, 3 to 4 times higher than the domestic market price in the US. The soaring price of natural gas has led to a sharp increase in the cost of living for the European population, and further aggravated inflation in Europe. The European governments are also exhausted by the demonstrations and marches that break out from time to time.